Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to Beyond Curious and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube keeps showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. My name's Renee Okafor. I'm 34 and for 6 years I have worked as a home health aide covering overnight shifts across a rural stretch of northeastern Connecticut, driving between clients on back roads that don't see much traffic after midnight. I've done this exact drive close to 1,000 times. I know which houses leave a porch light on, where the deer usually cross, the stretch of Kettle Ridge Road where my radio always loses signal for about 40 seconds. None of that mattered much on the night this happened, past the first few seconds. It was early July, a little past 1 in the morning, coming off a shift with my last client, a stubborn man named Walter Brannigan who chews a toothpick constantly, even at that hour. A habit he says helped him quit smoking 20 years ago. He waved at me through his window the way he always does, and I pulled onto Kettle Ridge Road. Radio low, windows cracked. The road narrows about a mile past his place. Tree line close on both sides, no street lights. It's a stretch I've made my peace with, the way you make peace with anything you do enough times. My headlights caught something crossing maybe 80 feet ahead. My first thought was deer, because that's what it almost always is out there. I eased off the gas, out of habit more than alarm. It wasn't a deer, it was upright, moving on 2 legs across the full width of the road in maybe 3 strides. Tall enough that I remember thinking, even in that half second, it would have to duck under the lowest branches along that stretch. It didn't. It cleared them without adjusting its posture at all. Dark, coarse-looking coat, wide through the shoulders in a way that didn't match anything I'd call human. A gait that covered ground faster than anything on 2 legs should, without ever looking like it was running. It was gone into the tree line before I'd even fully processed slowing down. I sat in the middle of that empty road for what felt like a full minute, foot on the brake, both hands locked on the wheel. I ran through the ordinary options out loud, to nobody. A person, somebody tall, in something dark, walking a road with no shoulder at 1 in the morning for no reason I could invent. I got about that far before I ran out of ways to make the shoulders fit. I called Walter back before I even pulled forward, mostly because I needed another voice more than I needed to report anything useful. "You see a deer get you again," he said, picking up on the second ring. Toothpick audible, the way it always is when he talks. "It wasn't a deer, Walt." My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. "It walked." He didn't say anything for a second. "Walked how?" "On 2 legs, across the whole road. It was tall, Walt, taller than the branches, and it didn't duck." The line stayed quiet long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Walter's the type who has a joke ready for everything. He didn't have one that night. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its usual sing-song. "My brother-in-law told me something like that, out near your stretch, about 2 months back. I told him to keep it to himself. Didn't want to be the reason somebody thought he'd lost it." I drove the rest of the way home well under the speed limit, checking my mirrors more than the road in front of me. I didn't sleep much once I got there. The next afternoon, still turning it over, I called the local barracks and reported it, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with what I'd seen. A trooper named Corporal Deshaun Ruiz took the report over the phone, and to his credit, didn't laugh or rush me off the line. He has a habit, I'd learn later when he actually came out to walk the road with me, of clicking his flashlight on and off a few times whenever he's thinking through something that doesn't have an easy next step. He clicked it a good 6 or 7 times, standing at the exact spot I described and looking at the tree line, before telling me the department had gotten 2 other calls that summer, describing something similar within a few miles of where I was standing. None of them were from people who struck him as looking for attention. Corporal Ruiz walked maybe 40 yards into the tree line with me that afternoon, more out of thoroughness than expectation. We found a stretch of underbrush that looked disturbed in a rough line heading away from the road. Nothing dramatic, no clear print in the dry summer ground, but enough broken stalks and bent brush that he crouched down and studied it for a good while before standing back up and telling me, honestly, that it didn't look like a deer had made it. It didn't look like a person had made it either. And he wasn't going to pretend he had a third explanation ready to offer me. I asked around the neighbourhood a little after that, carefully, because I didn't want to be the woman who saw a monster on Kettle Ridge Road. An older neighbour near Walter's place, a woman named Fern Higgins, who has a habit of twisting a rubber band around her wrist whenever she's deciding how much to tell you, mentioned, almost in passing, that her own father used to talk about something crossing that same stretch of road decades ago, back when it was still dirt. Her family had mostly treated it as one of his tall tales until she'd started hearing similar stories again this past year from at least 2 other households on the road. I did some looking of my own after that, mostly late at night when I couldn't sleep anyway. The kind of searching you tell yourself is just curiosity. I found a regional sighting tracking site where people log encounters by county. I found 4 other reports filed within about 6 miles of Kettle Ridge Road over the past 2 years. Each one was vague enough on its own to dismiss, but similar enough to each other in the details that mattered that I sat with my laptop open until almost 4 in the morning, cross-referencing them against the map. 3 of the 4 clustered along the same stretch of creek that runs behind the tree line I'd watched that shape disappear into. I didn't post anything myself, I just closed the laptop and told myself I had what I needed to know, which wasn't much, but was more than I'd had before. The second thing happened about 3 weeks later, and I only heard about it secondhand from one of my other regular clients. An elderly widow named Colleen Prusak lives about 2 miles down from Walter and keeps a motion-triggered camera on her detached garage after a string of package thefts the winter before. Colleen called me one afternoon, her voice tighter than usual, to ask, almost sheepishly, whether I'd heard anything about a bear getting into people's yards along our road. She'd found a clip from her camera, time-stamped a little after 3 in the morning, showing a tall, dark shape crossing the edge of her yard at the tree line, moving in that same unhurried, upright stride, gone from frame in under 2 seconds. The footage was too grainy and too brief to prove anything to anyone who hadn't already seen what I'd seen with my own eyes. But Colleen played it for me twice on her kitchen table, and neither of us said the word out loud that we were both clearly thinking. I still drive that route most nights. I haven't seen anything since, though I'll admit I take that stretch a little slower than I used to. Windows up now, regardless of the heat. Walter still waves at me from his window every night I leave his place, toothpick in his teeth. Neither of us has said much more about it since that first phone call, though he did mention a few weeks back that his brother-in-law finally agreed to file his own report with the department, almost a year after the fact. Colleen still keeps that camera running on her garage, and she checks the footage most mornings now in a way she never used to bother with before. She's asked me twice since that afternoon whether I think it's likely to come back around her property again. Both times I've told her honestly that I don't know, because I don't. What I do know is that she started leaving a light on over her back porch overnight, something she told me she hadn't done since her husband passed and she stopped feeling like there was anyone left to leave a light on for. Corporal Ruiz told me the last time I spoke with him that the file stays open on their end, logged but unresolved, the same as it was the day I called it in. He said the department doesn't have a formal way to close out a report like mine even if they wanted to, since there's no crime to charge and no missing person to find. Just a description, a timestamp, and a patch of disturbed brush that dried out and grew back over within a season. Nobody's caught anything on camera clearly enough to matter. Nobody's found a track worth casting. I know what I saw across that road in under 3 strides, and I know it's still out there somewhere past that tree line. Those are the only 2 things about that night I'm actually sure of. My name's Priya Sandhu. I'm 29, and I spent a little over a year as a contracted field technician on a small research team leasing a fenced grazing parcel in the high desert. It was land the government had quietly picked up 3 years before I ever set foot on it, officially for what our paperwork called atmospheric and electromagnetic monitoring. I still have a photocopy of the first incident report I ever helped file out there. Most of the second page is blacked out in thick redaction bars. I want to start with that document because it's the same one I'll come back to at the end of this. My supervisor, a lead physicist named Dr. Marcus Feld, had a habit of clicking a retractable pen open and shut whenever a calculation wasn't landing right. He briefed me on my second morning on site, plainly and without any drama. A repeatable aerial distortion, roughly triangular in outline, hovered at a fixed altitude above one specific set of coordinates on the property. It had first been logged by the team's instruments the year before I arrived. He told me it had been instrumentally confirmed across multiple sensor platforms and multiple field seasons, and that despite that, the team had never once been able to close the file on it. Not explained as equipment error, he said, tapping the pen once against the desk instead of clicking it. Not tied to anything natural or man-made. We just keep confirming it's there. And nobody's gone up to look at it directly, I asked. Once, early on, before my time. He set the pen down. The report from that flyover is one of the pages you'll see redacted. Draw your own conclusions. Government paperwork is careful by design, so I filed his answer under ordinary bureaucratic caution and went on calibrating sensors for 2 quiet months. Right up until the first night I was actually on shift and the distortion appeared on the live feed. It showed just after 10 at night. A faint shimmer above the marked coordinates thickened, over about 90 seconds, into a visible 3-sided warping of the air itself. It looked like heat distortion over pavement, but held a consistent geometric shape that didn't waver with the wind the way heat distortion should. Every instrument in the building spiked at once. Magnetometer readings jumped hard enough that Marcus's pen stopped clicking entirely, which told me more than anything he actually said out loud. We watched it for 11 minutes before it thinned back out and disappeared. The readings dropped back to baseline as cleanly as they'd spiked. I asked Marcus afterward, genuinely, what he thought it was. He was quiet for a long moment before he told me the honest answer was that after 3 field seasons of data, the team had more theories than evidence for any single one of them. His job wasn't to decide what it was, only to keep measuring it as precisely as possible and pass the data up the chain. He said that almost word for word, and I remember it because it sounded exactly like something written for a report, rather than something a person says off the cuff. It made me wonder how many times he'd had to say it. Dana Whitcomb, the federal liaison, had actually visited the site once before that night, early in my contract, though I hadn't understood at the time what her visit was really about. She'd walked the perimeter fence with Marcus for the better part of an afternoon, straightening her cufflinks every so often, and asking careful questions about our data retention protocols and who outside the team had access to the raw logs. At the time I'd assumed it was a routine compliance check. Looking back, I think she was quietly confirming the file was still contained before it had any reason not to be. The instrument readings themselves, on the nights the distortion appeared, went well beyond a simple magnetometer spike. Our gravimeter, a sensitive piece of equipment normally used to track tiny variations in local gravitational pull, recorded a measurable dip directly beneath the distortion's coordinates each time, small but consistent. It always returned to baseline the moment the shimmer thinned out. Twice the audio equipment we kept running as a matter of routine picked up a low, steady hum in a frequency range Marcus told me sat below what most people could consciously hear. More than one of us admitted, off the record, to feeling it in our teeth rather than hearing it outright. The distortion appeared 11 more times over the following 7 months, always at the same coordinates, always somewhere between 8 and 11 minutes in duration, though never on a schedule any of us could predict in advance. Each appearance came with the same instrument spike, the same clean return to baseline afterward, and twice with something else. Both times a technician stationed nearest the coordinates reported a stretch of missing time somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes each occurrence that didn't match the equipment's own time-stamped logs of the event. Both technicians were reassigned off the project within a month of reporting it. Neither one, as far as I know, ever spoke about it publicly. I tried reaching one of them myself, a soft-spoken tech named Obed Marsh, who I'd shared a few quiet night shifts with before his reassignment, mostly because I wanted to know, off the record, whether the missing time had felt the way I imagined it would. The number I had for him disconnected sometime that same year, and a short email I sent to his personal account bounced back undeliverable a few months later. I don't know if that means anything beyond an ordinary person changing jobs and phones the way people do. I've chosen, since then, not to go looking any further than that. Marcus told me once, late on a quiet shift when neither of us had much else to say to each other, that he'd asked Obed directly, before the reassignment came through, what the missing minutes had actually felt like from the inside. He said Obed had gone very still before answering, and had only said that it hadn't felt like anything at all, which was somehow the part that bothered him most. No dizziness, no dream logic. Just a clock that read differently than his own memory of the last several minutes did, with nothing in between to account for the gap. Marcus said he hadn't been able to think of a follow-up question that felt like it wouldn't make things worse for Obed, so he hadn't asked one. Hollis Teague, the rancher, stopped grazing cattle anywhere near that section of the parcel sometime before I ever arrived, a fact I only learned secondhand from another tech, since Hollis himself never brought it up directly. I asked him about it once carefully, while he was mending a stretch of fence well clear of the marked coordinates. "Your father know about the draw before the government ever leased it?" I asked. Hollis spit to the side before he answered, the way he always did. "My father ran cattle on this land 40 years before anybody in Washington cared about it. He steered the herd wide of that draw the whole time, called it bad ground, and left it at that." "Did he ever say why? Didn't have to?" Hollis went back to the fence wire. "First season I tried running my own herd through there myself. They steered wide of it on their own, same as his always did. Nobody taught them that. I stopped asking why a long time ago. A federal liaison named Donna Whitcomb visited the site twice during my contract. A careful, precise woman with a habit of straightening her cufflinks before she spoke on anything sensitive, as if buying herself a half-second to choose her words. She told our team on her second visit that the file on the anomaly remained open at every level she was aware of, that no agency above her had authorized a public statement, and that our non-disclosure agreements remained in full effect regardless of any broader disclosure conversations happening elsewhere in government at the time. She said that last part carefully, like she already knew it was becoming a harder line to hold. My contract ended on schedule. Not early. Not for cause. Just a normal rotation off the project, the way contracts like that are designed to work. Marcus stayed on for at least another year after I left, based on the one email he sent me around the holidays that winter. It was short and careful, mentioning only that the readings that season had been, in his words, more active than usual, without elaborating further. I never wrote back to ask what he meant by that, partly because I suspected he wouldn't have been able to answer past whatever his own agreement allowed, and partly because some part of me had already decided I didn't want to know more than I already did. I followed the recent disclosure news the same way anyone else can now. The same rolling policy changes everyone's heard about. I've wondered more than once whether the file I worked on for a year is anywhere in that pipeline, or whether it's still sitting exactly where Dana Whitcomb left it. Open. Unexplained. Legally unspoken. Hollis Teague, last I heard through a mutual contact still out there, still won't run cattle through that draw, memo or no memo, and says he doesn't expect that to change regardless of what Washington eventually decides to admit. I still have my photocopy of that first incident report, redaction bars and all, folded in the same drawer. The one line the censors missed, right at the bottom of the unredacted first page, still reads exactly the way it did the day I copied it. Anomaly confirmed, recurring. Cause undetermined. Recommend continued monitoring. Do not recommend closure of file at this time. My name's Naomi Osei. I'm 33, and for almost my entire life, my father, Daniel Osei, told me and my brother the same 3 sentences whenever we asked what he did during the 11 years before I was born. He was a contractor. It was boring. It's not something he could talk about, even if it weren't. We stopped asking sometime in our teens. That changed this past August, 3 days after a new federal memorandum lifted the non-disclosure agreements and secrecy oaths that had kept people like my father silent for decades. He called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if I could come by that weekend, alone, without my brother or my husband. I drove out that Saturday expecting bad medical news. Instead, I found him at the kitchen table with a small, battered lockbox I'd never seen in my life, his thumb working slowly along the edge of his wedding ring, a nervous habit my mother used to point out before she passed. "I need you to just let me get through this," he said, before I'd even sat down. "Before you ask anything. Dad, you're scaring me." "I know." He opened the lockbox. "That's fair." He told me he'd spent those 11 years as an engineering contractor attached to a program most people inside it were never allowed to name, even to each other, past a single internal designation. Materials analysis on paper. What actually came through the facility, at least twice during his time there, wasn't manufactured by anyone he'd ever call human. Some of it, he said, wasn't material at all. in the sense the word usually means. My first instinct was to reach for something that kept this inside a shape I understood. Stress, early memory trouble, a tired man dressing up a boring career so it would have mattered more. I got as far as opening my mouth to suggest it gently before he slid a stack of photographs across the table. Headers and signature blocks, dates spanning a decade, each one stamped with a classification marking well above anything a materials analysis contractor should have had legal access to. Whatever I'd been about to say, I didn't say it. He told me about the facility itself in careful, general terms. A low, windowless building he described only as sitting well outside the town. Most of the contractors told their families they worked near, reached by a service road that didn't appear on any public map he ever saw. His own role, he said, was materials engineering, testing tolerances and reactions on samples that arrived already logged and numbered by someone else entirely. Most days he genuinely didn't know the full picture of what he was handling, only how it behaved under stress, heat, and pressure that should have destroyed anything he'd been trained to expect. He told me about a colleague from those years, a woman he only ever called by her first name, Renata, who'd worked alongside him for nearly 6 years before she was quietly transferred out after asking one too many questions in a briefing about where the recovered material was actually sourced from. He said Renata had a habit back then of tapping 2 fingers against the side of her coffee cup whenever a briefing was going somewhere she didn't like. She'd been tapping that cup steadily, faster and faster, the entire length of the meeting that got her reassigned. What happened to her after? I asked. I don't know, not really. He turned one of the photographs over in his hands. I heard, years later, through somebody who still had contacts, that she'd been moved through 2 more postings, then nothing. A file that says early medical retirement and doesn't say why. Did you ever try to find her? He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Once, I got as far as an old area code before I put the phone down. Called it none of my business anymore. Truth is, I was scared of what I'd hear if I finished dialing. I did some quiet digging of my own in the weeks after that first conversation, mostly through Public Freedom of Information Act reading rooms and a handful of declassified document databases that had grown noticeably more active since the memo. I never found my father's name attached to anything, which didn't surprise him when I mentioned it, since he'd always been several rungs below the level where names tend to survive in any surviving paperwork. I did find a single line, in a heavily redacted budget justification from roughly the same years he described, referencing a materials analysis program by an internal designation that matched, almost exactly, the one he'd used at his own kitchen table. Seeing it printed in an actual government document, however thin the confirmation, did something to my chest I wasn't fully prepared for. I showed him the printout the next time I visited. He read it twice, set it down on the table, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's it," he said finally. "That's the one." "You sure?" "I typed memos with that designation for 11 years, Naomi. I'd know it blind." He slid the paper back across to me, gently, like it might still be able to hurt one of us. I didn't expect to ever see it printed anywhere I was allowed to look. My father described the actual recovered material only in careful, restrained fragments, and I've decided, telling this now, to keep that same restraint, rather than embellish what he gave me. He said some of it moved when nothing should have been moving it. He said one incident, roughly 2 decades ago, resulted in 3 technicians being hospitalized for injuries. The official report attributed to equipment malfunction, an explanation he said nobody on the floor that day actually believed. He said the strangest part, for him, wasn't any single incident, but the sheer administrative normalcy surrounding all of it. The same tired coffee, the same fluorescent lighting, the same mundane paperwork cycles, wrapped around something that broke every category he'd been trained to file things under. He signed his original non-disclosure agreement in his late 20s, he told me, understanding it as a standard contractor formality, not fully grasping until years later that it would functionally outlast the rest of his working life. He said he'd wanted, more than once, over the following decades, to tell my mother the truth. He'd come close exactly twice, both times stopping himself at the last sentence, telling her instead some version of the same 3 lines he'd later give my brother and me. He said that silence, more than anything he'd actually witnessed on the job, was the part of those 11 years he regretted most. The memo that changed things arrived for him as a short formal notice through a government portal he still had access to, informing him plainly that any prior agreement prohibiting disclosure was no longer in force. He read it, he told me, standing at his own kitchen counter, 3 separate times before he believed it applied to him personally, and not just to people higher up the chain than he'd ever been. He called the number listed for questions and spoke with someone who confirmed in a flat, procedural tone that yes, this did apply to contractors at his level, and that yes, he was now free to discuss his service history with immediate family, though the agency still asked, as a courtesy rather than a legal requirement, that specific technical details remain unshared. He asked me, near the end of that afternoon, whether I believed him. I told him I did, mostly because of the exhaustion in how he told it. Nothing dramatic, nothing performed, just a tired man finally setting down something heavy after 30 years of carrying it silently. He asked me not to repeat the specifics to anyone outside our immediate family, and I've kept that promise here, which is part of why this story stays as restrained as it does. Before I left that evening, he told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought while walking me to my car. He said he'd received a call 2 weeks earlier from a blocked number, a voice he didn't recognize, asking only whether he'd seen the recent memo and whether he intended to make use of it. He said he'd answered honestly that he intended to tell his children the truth and nothing more. The voice on the other end had simply said that was appreciated and hung up. He told me he hadn't mentioned that part to the agency's own hotline, and he asked me, quietly, standing in his driveway, whether I thought that had been a courtesy check or a warning. I didn't have an answer for him then. I still don't have one now. I've called him most evenings since that weekend, more than I used to, and each time he tells me a little more, always in the same careful, restrained way, never quite giving me the full technical picture he still won't cross that line on. He told me last week that 2 other former colleagues from those years, people he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, had reached out to him directly after the memo, each of them clearly testing whether it was safe to talk at all before saying much of anything. He said all 3 of them had landed, independently, on the same instinct, telling their own children the same restrained version he'd told me, and nothing more, at least for now. He said he still doesn't know how many people from that program are choosing silence over the version he chose, and he said that not knowing bothers him more than he expected it would. My father sleeps better these days, by his own account, than he has in years. I still think about Renata's coffee cup more than I probably should, and about how many other calls like his went out that same week, to people who may not have answered them the same way he did.